Ethan Miller had never considered himself someone who stood out. He worked steadily, paid his bills on time, and tried to keep the fragile peace within his long-term relationship with Ryan Carter, a peace that had slowly thinned into something fragile and silent. Over the past year, Ryan's long work hours, combined with Ethan's own emotional exhaustion, had created a distance that neither of them named but both felt deeply. Ethan often wondered whether this quiet stretch of indifference was simply a phase or the slow unraveling of something that once felt unbreakable. On a warm Thursday afternoon, Ethan's routine life shifted. He was at a charity art exhibition downtown, invited by a friend who insisted he needed a break from thinking too much. Ethan wandered between the displays, sipping sparkling water, quietly observing the confident people who moved through the space like they belonged there. He never felt entirely like one of them, until someone spoke his name with surprising certainty. Ethan Miller. Ethan turned and found a tall man with sharp features and a composed expression. He wore a dark navy suit that fit him perfectly, the type of confidence that seemed effortless. His eyes held genuine interest, not the superficial kind Ethan was used to at such events. "Yes, do we know each other?" Ethan asked. "Not officially," the man replied with a small, warm smile. "I'm Christopher Hale. I've followed some of your work online. You have an incredible eye for detail." Ethan blinked in quiet surprise. Very few people noticed his work, let alone someone who carried himself like a man who rarely needed to introduce himself. "You've seen my work." "I have," Christopher replied smoothly. "And I'd like to see more." The compliment lingered longer than it should have. Ethan wasn't accustomed to being seen, truly seen, especially lately. Ryan used to look at him that way, but those days had dissolved into hurried mornings and distracted evenings. Christopher walked beside him, guiding the conversation effortlessly. There was no arrogance in his tone, only an attentive calmness that made Ethan feel strangely steady. When they stopped in front of one of Ethan's displayed pieces, a quiet photograph of a fog-covered pier, Christopher studied it with a sincerity that made Ethan's chest tighten. "You capture loneliness in a way that feels honest," Christopher said softly. "Not tragic, just real." Ethan swallowed, feeling the truth of that statement pierce deeper than he expected. "I suppose I try." "You succeed," Christopher replied. "And I'd like to talk more about your process. Would you join me at my home sometime this weekend? I have a space I think you'd appreciate, and perhaps a project we could discuss." The invitation came with the ease of a man used to offering opportunities, but Ethan hesitated. Going to a stranger's house, especially one who radiated wealth and confidence, did not align with his cautious nature. Yet something about Christopher's demeanor felt strangely grounded. Not pushy, not rehearsed. "I don't want to impose," Ethan said quietly. "You wouldn't be," Christopher assured him. "It's an invitation, not an obligation. If it feels right, come. If not, no hard feelings." Ethan nodded politely, though inside, conflict stirred. He wasn't sure what he needed anymore: attention, clarity, or simply a reminder that he still mattered to someone. He exchanged numbers with Christopher before leaving the gallery, his thoughts in a tangled drift. When Ethan arrived home that evening, Ryan was seated on the couch, scrolling through emails with tired eyes. He looked up briefly, offering the familiar half-smile that once made Ethan feel anchor steady. Now, it barely reached Ryan's eyes. "How was the event?" Ryan asked, already glancing back at his screen. "It was fine," Ethan replied. He wanted to say more, to mention Christopher, the conversation, the unexpected spark of being noticed, but something held him back. Maybe guilt, maybe fear of how Ryan would react, maybe the quiet understanding that Ryan hadn't really listened in months. "Glad you got out for a bit," Ryan murmured. His voice wasn't unkind, just distant. Ethan sat beside him, close but not connected, the space between them heavier than he wished to admit. Christopher's invitation replayed in his mind, echoing with possibilities he wasn't ready to name. Later that night, after Ryan fell asleep, Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The message Christopher sent, "Let me know if Saturday works for you," glowed on his phone. Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen. He shouldn't say yes, he knew that, but he also knew he was tired of feeling invisible. And that simple truth made the choice far more complicated than it should have been. Saturday arrived with an unusual weight. Ethan Miller woke before sunrise, his thoughts restless and scattered. He had spent the previous night debating whether he should go to Christopher Hale's house, replaying every conversation from the gallery, every quiet moment of neglect with Ryan Carter, and every longing he refused to name. By morning, the decision still felt uncertain, but the message he eventually sent, "I can stop by this afternoon," settled the matter. Ryan worked the weekend shift and left early, offering Ethan a distracted goodbye kiss that barely grazed his cheek. The absence of warmth stung more than Ethan expected. It wasn't cruelty, it was simply routine. Comfortable, predictable, and painfully distant. By the time Ethan drove through the gated entrance to Christopher's estate, he felt a mixture of nerves and curiosity. The property stretched out across a gentle hillside, surrounded by well-kept gardens and tall sycamore trees. The mansion itself was elegant but not flashy, stone walls, wide windows, and clean architectural lines. It felt intentional, not performative, which surprised Ethan. Christopher greeted him at the door with the same calm confidence he carried at the gallery. His clothes were casual this time, dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, which made him appear younger, more approachable. "I'm glad you came," Christopher said, stepping aside. "I wasn't sure I would," Ethan admitted, walking in. "Honesty," Christopher replied with a smile. A rare trait. The interior of the mansion held an understated beauty. Warm lighting, quietly polished surfaces, and walls filled with art that carried stories rather than price tags. Christopher led him to a spacious room at the back of the house, a studio with high ceilings, wide skylights, and a large wooden table covered with sketches, photographs, and architectural models. "This is where I work," Christopher said. "I thought you might like to see it." The space felt alive. Ethan moved slowly, absorbing the details, feeling a sense of belonging he couldn't explain. "It's incredible," he whispered. "It's meaningful to share it with someone who understands craft," Christopher said gently. "Most people who visit see cost before creativity." Ethan met his eyes, and for a moment, the air shifted. Not romantically, simply with the unexpected recognition of two people who see the world in similar shades. Christopher guided him to a series of photographs laid out on the table. Landscapes taken during early travels, portraits of people whose expressions revealed layered stories. He explained his intentions behind each one, his voice steady and sincere. The conversation eased into something natural and balanced. Christopher didn't dominate the room, nor did he perform for admiration. He asked about Ethan's work, listened without interrupting, and studied Ethan's words with genuine interest. "You have a gift," Christopher said after a quiet pause. "You capture emotions most people avoid." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I'm not sure anyone sees that." "I do," Christopher replied softly. "And I think you deserve to be seen." The sincerity in his voice unsettled Ethan. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it filled a void he had learned to ignore. Ryan used to notice his smallest details, but life had worn that attention thin. Hearing such validation from someone new, someone who seemed to understand him effortlessly, felt dangerous in ways Ethan couldn't define. They stepped onto the balcony that overlooked the property. It was peaceful, touched by the golden afternoon light. Ethan leaned against the railing, letting the quiet settle around them. "Are you happy, Ethan?" Christopher asked suddenly, not intrusively, but with a kind of intuitive sensitivity. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I don't know anymore. I used to think I was. Now I'm not so sure." "Relationships evolve," Christopher said. "But sometimes we stay in them long after our hearts have slipped away." Ethan looked down, conflicted. "I'm not trying to run from anything. I'm not asking you to," Christopher replied. "But you deserve to reconnect with yourself. If your heart is tired, that's not failure. It's human." The words landed heavier than expected. Part of Ethan wanted to defend Ryan, but another part recognized the truth in what Christopher said. Emotional distance had become their new normal. Christopher rested his hand lightly on the balcony's edge, close to Ethan's but not touching. There was no pressure, only presence. A silent invitation to breathe, to reflect, to feel something quietly profound. For the first time in months, Ethan felt seen. Not for his shortcomings or his silence, but for the depth he usually kept hidden. As the sun dipped lower, Christopher turned to him. "You're welcome here anytime," he said. "Not for work. Not for me. For you." Ethan didn't answer immediately. The stillness between them offered both comfort and danger. He knew that coming here had changed something small but irreversible. And as he drove away that evening, the echo of Christopher's kindness lingered like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Ethan Miller spent the drive home replaying every moment of the afternoon, the quiet sincerity in Christopher Hale's voice, the warmth in his eyes, the gentle steadiness of his presence. Nothing inappropriate had happened, no lines crossed, no promises made, yet something undeniably shifted inside Ethan. His heart felt both awakened and unsettled, as if someone had opened a window in a room he hadn't realized was suffocating. When he stepped into the apartment, Ryan Carter was already home. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, surrounded by half-finished notes for a presentation. He looked up briefly, offering a tired but familiar smile. "Hey," Ryan said, "how was your day?" Ethan paused, unsure how to package the truth into something simple. "Different," he replied softly. "In a good way, I think." Ryan nodded, but the disinterest was unintentional rather than cruel. "Glad you got out for a bit," he murmured before returning to his work. That small moment, the absence of curiosity, the lack of follow-up, struck Ethan harder than he expected. He sat across from Ryan, watching the man he had spent years with slowly disappear behind the glow of a computer screen. The silence between them was familiar, but tonight it felt heavier, almost reflective. Ethan wondered whether the distance had always been there, or whether he had grown so used to it that he stopped noticing. He cleared his throat gently. "Ryan, do you ever feel like something's shifting between us?" Ryan looked up, surprised. "Shifting how?" "I don't know," Ethan said carefully. "Like we've been moving on parallel paths instead of one together." Ryan frowned, thoughtful rather than defensive. "Work's been rough. I know I've been distracted. But it's not because I don't care." "I know," Ethan said, and he meant it. Ryan wasn't negligent, he was overwhelmed. But good intentions didn't erase loneliness. I miss us." Ryan closed the laptop and rubbed his temples. "I miss us too," he admitted. "I'm trying, Ethan. I hope you see that." The vulnerability in his voice eased some of Ethan's tension. Yet another truth lingered unspoken, the recognition that missing something wasn't always enough to bring it back. Later that night, after Ryan fell asleep beside him, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. Christopher's voice echoed in his thoughts, "You deserve to reconnect with yourself." It wasn't a romantic temptation that haunted him, it was the realization that he had allowed his world to shrink until he barely recognized himself within it. The next day, Ethan found himself standing outside a quiet cafe downtown. He had texted Christopher earlier, not to arrange anything significant but simply to thank him for the previous afternoon. Christopher had responded with a simple invitation, "If you'd like to talk, I'm nearby." Ethan entered the cafe and spotted Christopher at a corner table, reading. He looked up, offering a calm, genuine smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Christopher said. "I wasn't sure either," Ethan replied, taking the seat across from him. There was no tension, no expectation, only quiet understanding. Christopher asked how he was, and Ethan found himself speaking with surprising honesty. He talked about Ryan, the distance between them, the fear of complacency, and the unfamiliar clarity he felt after visiting the mansion. "I don't want to hurt him," Ethan said quietly. "I still care about him. But I'm starting to realize I haven't cared about myself in a long time." Christopher listened without interrupting. "Choosing yourself isn't betrayal," he said gently. "It's recognition. And recognition is often the first step toward meaningful change." Ethan exhaled shakily. "I don't know what comes next." Quote, "You don't have to," Christopher replied. "You just have to acknowledge what you feel. The rest will follow." The simplicity of that truth washed over Ethan like steadying warmth. He wasn't obligated to make sweeping decisions or abandon anything. He only needed to be honest, with Ryan, with Christopher, and most importantly, with himself. They talked for an hour, not about romance or promises, but about direction, growth, and the complexity of choosing a life that matched the person he was becoming. When they finally stood to leave, Christopher offered a quiet reassurance. "You're navigating something difficult," he said. "But you're not alone in it. Even if my role is simply to remind you who you are." Ethan felt both grateful and deeply conflicted. Christopher's presence made him feel understood, yet he knew that emotional resonance could be dangerous if left unexamined. Still, he didn't regret coming. Outside the cafe, the late afternoon sun cast quiet shadows across the street. Ethan stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool air. His relationship with Ryan wasn't finished, but it wasn't unbroken either. His connection with Christopher wasn't defined, but it wasn't insignificant. For the first time in a long while, Ethan recognized that he stood at the threshold of change, messy, uncertain, and necessary. Whatever came next would demand honesty, courage, and a willingness to step into the unknown. But he felt ready, or at least, more ready than he had ever been.